All right, AP World History students, this is lesson 6.3, which means it's time to get anxious and depressed here in the wake of World War I. So, World War I is a disillusioning experience for just about everybody. In the 19th century, Europeans are, doing the white man's burden and seeing themselves as the vanguards of civilization and progress and like the scientific pinnacle of the human species. And at the end of World War I, you say, what was this for? All the modernism and all the progress of the previous century seemed to lead into not even a dead end, but just sort of a moral black hole of butchery and a self-serving treaty that didn't seem to resolve much. And the art and the science and the literature of the period following the war expresses a great deal of skepticism about modernism. I want to be clear here, I'm not a scientist, but there's a couple interesting applications where ideas from science seem to converge with this sort of skepticism or this pessimism. So you have Einstein's theory of relativity, that even something as seemingly objective as time is relative. Like an hour is not an hour if you're traveling at the speed of light, for example. And so it's dependent on the observer. And then there's this Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which I cannot explain to you, I promise you. The uncertainty principle is under this umbrella of ideas discovered by physicists that once you get down to the subatomic level, all the old Newtonian laws of physics, this sort of like perfect set of laws that were universal and clear, suddenly don't apply at the subatomic level. Once electrons are being observed, then they actually behave differently than if they weren't being observed, and so you can never actually objectively know about the electrons. And this is a really complicated idea, but I will submit to you, it's sort of similar to if Mr. Beckering wants to know about what life is like in AP World History class, he can come into AP World History class, but that really won't be an objective knowledge of what AP World History class is like, because by the act of Mr. Beckering entering the classroom, the students behave differently when they are being observed. Things being observed sometimes behave differently. And so in this skeptical sense, I would say to Mr. Beckering, you can never actually know what AP World History class is like, because the act of you coming through the door changes the room, and it changes the students. Then Sigmund Freud. Now Freud, a lot of his ideas have been discredited, but he does start this, he's a psychologist who really opens up the idea of the subconscious mind. And what Freud ultimately did, there's a whole great number of things that he does, but the biggest thing he does, the biggest thing that Freud enunciates is a certain pessimistic notion about human nature, which is we are not rational. We are driven in the end by our id, which is like the 3-year-old child hidden inside all of us that wants food and power and sex and sleep and to hit the person next to us that's really bothering us. But all these things that we've been sort of trained over the course of our lives by our parents and pastors and teachers, that that's wrong and we shouldn't do those things. But Freud says that's actually why, part of the reason why we have neurosis is that we've got all these sort of repressed desires and this like internal struggle within us between our desires and between our ego and our superego trying to like have it out and make sense. And he says that's why our dreams are all messed up. He has people talk and talk and talk to try to untangle what's in their subconscious. But the basic core of that is we are not rational creatures. That's a pessimistic notion. And all of this is sort of the origins of postmodernism. You guys talk about that a lot in your Bible classes, but this rejection of the idea of objectivity, the rejection of a notion of absolute truth. And it just sort of comes, it sort of is in keeping with this post-World War I period of like, where did all this modernism and science and rationalism get us? We were killing each other with it. We didn't get anywhere with it. This shows up in art as well. Subjectivism, or art that expressed something about the artist, rather than an objective notion, or rather than reflected an objective reality, became in vogue. we have photography now by the 1920s and 1930s, and so why do we need realism in our painting? And so abstraction becomes the preferred mode of art, and the idea is we're going to abstract not for abstraction's sake, but we're going to abstract to actually depict a better picture of what my own reality is, what the artist's reality is. And it actually has this way of sort of destroying objective ways of assessing and analyzing art. Art becomes something that's about expression primarily. So the Frida Kahlo painting you see there is a painting about her having a divided identity. Or there's art that's designed strictly to shock or strictly to be absurd. And the whole purpose of absurdist art is just to help people recognize the fact that life itself, or existence itself, is absurd, and there is no great purpose, and there is no great meaning. And so you do things like people looking for something great and meaningful, you present to them instead a men's urinal, as if to say there is no meaning and there is no purpose, and to sort of reflect on the fact that you exist right now, and what does that mean, and what are we to do with this? Again, we're sensing, though, the skepticism, the pessimism of this post-war period. I'll show you an example or two. This example, I picked two things here that just shows the difference in where art was moving here from the 19th century into the 20th century. And we just see the different emphasis that's happening. This is a famous image by Picasso. Now, Picasso is actually commenting on the Spanish Civil War and the onset of fascism, and this is in the early 1930s. But again, this is this is Cubist, where he just sort of takes any perspective or angles and instead kind of like mixes them up or mashes them all up against the panel, so to speak. And what it's about is misery and the horror of war. And it's a nightmarish image. But that's what art becomes about. It's about expressing a certain idea through abstraction. And the ideas tended to be, they were often dark, or they were often disturbing. More dark and disturbing than the artistic state of things in the post-war period is perhaps the economic state of things. The 1920s, if you're outside Germany is a total mess from the time World War I ends and on. But the 1920s is a fairly good period of economic recovery. This is especially true in the United States. Now, of course, the United States hadn't really been touched by the war. But it's not, by the end of the 1920s, there is the Great Depression. And the Great Depression begins in the United States, but it's going to go, it becomes a contagion that's going to go everywhere. It's going to affect everything. And it's going to become one of the main factors that leads directly into World War II. So explaining the Great Depression is difficult. Like all the things in history, it's not monocausal. One of the reasons is Germany is sort of being made to repay back these huge loans. Germany doesn't have the money to do that, so U.S. banks are giving payments to Germany so that Germany can pay back France and England. And meanwhile, the U.S. is saying to France and England, hey, we borrowed you guys a whole bunch of money in the war. How about we get that back now? And France and England are actually resentful and frustrated that the U.S. wants this back after they've been allies and partners in the war. And the U.S. is saying, hey, business is business. And so all these economies in the world are kind of tied together. And the origin of that is money coming from the U.S. banks, but there's trouble signs by the late 1920s. The Roaring Twenties, as it's called in the United States, is a period of like fast economic growth, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. Automobiles were newly affordable in the early 20th century, and so you've got kind of the first generation of Americans buying their first automobiles, and that creates a real sugar rush in the economy. There's banking practices that are a little bit funny, and a lot of people are borrowing money from banks to buy stock in the stock market. It's called buying on margin. And so supply in the stock market was a little bit inflated, and so the prices for stocks were going up, 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 up. By the late 1920s, the economy is starting to slow down a little bit, and economists are saying, yeah, we're probably due for a little bit of a downturn, and that's sort of like everyone's looking around saying, when is the downturn going to come? When is the downturn going to come? Especially in the stock market, created a panic in 1929, Black Tuesday, in October, where there was a selling panic and the stock market collapses in the United States. Around the same time, natural disaster hit the farmers in the United States with a terrible drought in the Great Plains region. And so you have stockbrokers losing a ton of money. You have businesses losing a ton of value in the stock market. You have natural disaster hitting. And these bad things, these discouraging or panicky things are happening, and they contribute to a collapse in the banking system in the United States, which was also, it was not a well-regulated banking system at the time. Bank runs are when people are worried that their bank is in the process of collapsing or that they've overextended credit, which banks had in the 1920s, and that they weren't going to, that their savings would be lost. And so people in this panic, they go to the banks and demand to take out their money. And if enough people do that, and if the bank kind of can't secure enough money for everyone else, you can have a bank collapse. And at that point, everyone else who's got their savings accounts or checking accounts in that bank is wiped out. That money is just gone. And that happens to more than 3,000 banks in the United States starting in 1929 and then for the next couple of years. And so just tens of thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands, get affected by these banking collapses. And that when the banks are collapsing, then people can't get credit and businesses can't get credit. And when people and businesses can't get credit, they stop spending money. And when people aren't spending money, businesses have to cut back production, so they have to lay off workers, and you get a poisoned, nasty, ugly economic cycle where everybody's just shriveling up and not spending money, and we get frozen. And manufacturing levels drop terribly. I mean, you can look at this. By 1932, you're at half the manufacturing levels in the United States that you had in 1929, and a quarter of American workers were unemployed. And now those banks in the United States can't afford to pay back the money to Germany that's supposed to go to France and England, and so the contagion hits those places too. And then the U.S. makes another bad mistake by going against free trade and instead putting up these big tariffs. They say, we're going to protect American businesses by putting a high tax on imported goods. But what happens there, and you're doing that because you say, now Americans, it's cheaper to buy American goods, and so we'll buy American and we'll save American jobs. That's fine, but you're only looking at half the picture. American businesses also rely on exporting goods all around the world. And when the United States government puts a really high tariff on all these imported goods, other countries, European countries, respond in kind by saying, you put a high tariff on our stuff? Fine, we'll slap a high tariff on your stuff. And so now American companies that rely on exporting their goods, that demand drops off. They slow down production, they fire more workers, and so instead of having more economic activity, which is what was needed in 1930, 31, 32, instead international trade kind of freezes up and you've just got a really ugly situation. All right? So I gave you some reasons. Banking failures, collapse in the U.S. stock market, some natural disaster, tariffs that ended up slowing down trade. What is the Great Depression? It's depressing. It is an emotional thing as well as an economic thing. Economically, it just means really high unemployment. Again, a quarter of U.S. workers. That's the highest we've ever had measured. Failure of banking systems. And then popular agitation and unrest. Right? This becomes just a breeding ground for socialist agitators or communist agitators or anarchist agitators. People who are saying, well, clearly the status quo has failed and it's time for something dramatically different and new. And this is felt everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. This is not just an American experience. It's felt all in Latin America. It's felt in Japan, in Europe. It becomes one of the reasons why the Nazi Party rises to power in Germany, for example. We'll get there. So what do people do? Governments began to change in in very striking ways and in very modern ways as a result of this Great Depression. The first really modern state welfare systems get created during this period. And again, the idea there is that these would shield people from the worst effects. People came to say an appropriate role for government is to shield some of the citizens from some of the worst things that can happen there. As an economic philosophy, we see the rise of this idea of Keynesianism, driven by this economist named John Maynard Keynes, who says that when a depression is happening and when people are shriveling up and not spending as much, and businesses aren't spending, and banks aren't lending, and people aren't spending, aren't buying, boats and summer homes and stuff like that, or new cars, what a government needs to do is lower interest rates to help it make it easier to borrow, and also just spend a whole bunch of money. Stimulate the economy by having the government dump a bunch of money in. Even if that means going into debt, the government needs to spend a lot of money to kind of like shock the system into action and get things moving around again. And so in the United States, that looked like just sort of, the government saying, who needs a new city hall? You, all right, you got it. Who needs new schools, new bridges, new dams? We're going to build this stuff as a way to stimulate the economy. And of course, it doesn't end the Depression anywhere. World War II is what will end the Depression. But this economic theory of Keynesianism, that when we have hard times, what the government needs to do is a blitz of spending, is something that becomes kind of textbook economics for a long time. Now, of course, the other half of Keynesianism is that when economic times are good, the government needs to run a balanced budget and raise interest rates and sort of run a much tighter ship. And that sometimes is a less popular option for people and has a funny way of not happening as much. But that's an issue for another day. Okay, so post-war period, you have skepticism about modernity and progress. You have skepticism about objective fact and truth itself. You have art becoming more pessimistic and about expression rather than some objective truth. And you have a Great Depression landing that has major economic, social, political effects everywhere. As we move ahead, we're going to talk about how totalitarian systems rose from all this mess and where that's going to bring us in the late 1930s and 1940s. You guys have a great day. Until then, see ya.